What I'm fascinated with is something that we are really missing in Germany. Although this room, I must say, reminds me somewhat of the University of Constance because of its leaks. You know, this is very everyday experience for people from this new modern roof, flat roof, which always leaks.
It is especially for you not to be nostalgic, you know.
But what you are really have taught me here and what I'm experiencing and I'm fascinated with is the idea how the location colors and directs the thought, and that you are organizing something that is really extraterritorial. Coming from a country in which intellectual thinking is totally saturated because of institutional organizations, it all happens in the universities more or less, at least from my perspective, and it really doesn't move anywhere, and certainly not out of the universities. I'm really fascinated with what goes on here, that you are a magnet around whom or which so many people, you know, combine and meet and circulate, and you keep all of this energy running. And I think that is an immensely important project, and I really congratulate you, and I wish you well for the next, similarly, many years. So.
And it's my pleasure to greet you, Jan, and all other participants there. And it's a great pleasure and honor. And I'm happy if you appreciate your come. Hope you'll become, you know, just our permanent participant.
Okay, thank you. I will speak about politeness, respect, civility, basic values for a post-ideological age. Yesterday we talked about being open to things that happen unexpectedly. That was, I think, the gist of Sepp's talk. And I think here is one thing that happened unexpectedly, to which we opened ourselves, namely youth revolts have arisen in Iran in June 2009, and now various Arab states since the beginning of this year, which are no longer driven by ideologies or charismatic figures. This is absolutely new. This new generation has neither clear-cut political programs nor slogans. They fight for fuzzy values such as lifestyle and freedom of thought and communication. They resent political corruption and call out for a decent and transparent society that allows for more equality and participation. Today, this new generation is marked by an ideology fatigue. The young people are no longer ready to fight for elevated ideals or charismatic leaders. Revolutionary energies are no longer fueled by political theories or utopian ideals, but by rage and indignation about the constant violence of what they consider to be, quote, basic human rights. Now, what will take the place of slogans and ideologies that ruled the 20th century? I want to introduce in my paper the terms politeness, respect, and civility as new possible value candidates for our post-ideological age. The concepts of civility and politeness originated in medieval courts, courtoisie, and underwent a structural change when they were taken over and redefined in the European cities. Now, this is the introduction to a small historical excursion. But I focus on the early 18th century. At this time, London grew to be the biggest city of the Western world. In this city, two powerful motors pushed the progress of modernization and democratization. This was banking and printing. With his popular daily papers, the journalist and publisher, a colleague of yours, Joseph Addison, helped to lay the foundations for an extended reading public, for which he created a program for civic education. In one of his essays, he commented on the World Trade Center of the early 18th century, the so-called Royal Exchange in the city of London. This is how he described his experience. I'm infinitely delighted in mixing with these several ministers of commerce, Sometimes I am jostled among a body of Armenians. Sometimes I am lost in a crowd of Jews, and sometimes make one in a group of Dutchmen. I am a Dane, Swede, or Frenchman at different times, or rather fancy myself like the old philosopher who, being asked what countryman he was, replied that he was a citizen of the world. Addison conceived of trade as the new distinctive feature of a new cosmopolitan world. This world was shaped more by merchants than by politicians. Trade, Addison discovered, promotes the social common sense, which is built on the economic common interest of the middle class. Money and commerce obviously neutralize strangeness because they create new alliances and interdependencies, which have to be backed up by civil interaction and new forms of intercultural communication. After the religious civil war of the 17th century, Addison conceived of his time as a post-ideological age. As the global market, which effected a thorough transformation of traditional loyalties and boundaries, required new forms of smooth contact and connectivity. He and his friend Shaftesbury introduced such new forms of contact. They focused on this problem and prescribed a new civil code for the new society. New social context they devised, he invested in the traditional concept of politeness, radically changed its traditional meaning. It was no longer conceived as a codified repertoire of elaborate rules of conduct, for instance, such as those that the Earl of Shaftesbury transmitted to his illegitimate son. Instead, it required first and foremost a new relation of oneself to others. Shaftesbury politeness is mediated through the individual and the individual through whom the society comes to terms with itself. He thus hoped to bridge the gap between individual and society through this concept of politeness. It is thus much more than a key to reputation or success. It is rather the form in which social good as civility is maintained and reproduced. Civility creates politeness, politeness guarantees civility. To quote Shaftesbury, all politeness is owing to liberty. We polish one another and rub off our corners and rough sides by a sort of amicable collision. To restrain this, meaning the amicable collision, is inevitably to bring a rust upon man's understandings. It is a destroying of civility, good feeling, and even charity itself under pretense of maintaining it. Now, Shaftesbury suggested that this amicable collision automatically leads to a smooth surface, which humans gain through communication under the condition of a generalized and anonymous interaction. Shaftesbury's concept of politeness is not only derived from Greek polis, but also from the word polish in a way. The principle of amicable collision is the literal replacement for previous forms of social control and measures of discipline, which it was believed were no longer needed once sociality, civility had become the central and all-encompassing norm. Political and religious values had to be bracketed and neutralized in order to make place for the new norm of civility. Shaftesbury's problem was one that we are very familiar with today, because it is at the core of all transitional societies. On which path, this is the question, on which path can we move from a civil war to a civil society, from civil war to civil society? 2 generations after this traumatic experience and the religious fundamentalism of Puritan theocracy, Shaftesbury developed a civic philosophy of politeness. For him now, the key opposition of the new era was no longer true or false or friend or foe. By the way, Carl Schmitt took his friend or foe distinction exactly from the paradigm of the English Civil War. But it was for him civil versus uncivil. The new norm of civility had to be internalized, however, by the individual. He and she had to embody it. This concern for humanizing humans was based on a principle of self-education, a program actually, which is the opposite of the collective modernist ideology of creating a new man. It has nothing to do with inordinate utopian ambitions and is confined to the moderate project of making humans just a little bit less intolerable. For Shaftesbury, to be a little less intolerable person meant to be a somewhat more dialogic person. The dictator, the fundamentalist, the fanatic, the dogmatic, the authoritarian teacher, the pedant, these are all, they all share the monologic character trait which negates the norm of civility. Whatever they have to say is intolerable because it is bound to be apodictic, idiosyncratic, non-communicative, and non-generalizable. Shaftesbury's dialogical type is conceived against the background of this monological type. He has internalized the norm of civility, has internalized the social other, and has polished away his or her crudities. Now, I jump and summarize the next paragraph, which I'm cutting, by saying that politeness and civility sound today like rather feeble and old-fashioned tools when it comes to containing the growing global pressure of cultural differences. And we have referred to cultural studies actually as the new discourse that frames especially cultural difference. So in the second part of my paper, I will deal with the career of the new concept of respect, which has taken the place of politeness. While politeness has a long history, respect is a new term in our social vocabulary. Its career is linked to an epochal change of sensibility that has to do with a new perception of the other as victim. As this kind of respect is not spontaneously granted, it has to be claimed. Richard Sennett has written, modern societies lack positive forms of expression for respect and the recognition of others across social boundaries. Respect comes from the Latin word respicere and means literally to look back, pay attention, and is thus connected to cardinal virtues of politeness. The term replaces an older one which is slowly going out of use, namely tolerance. Tolerance was considered the greatest cultural achievement of the 18th century, maybe the highest value of the 18th century. This term today has lost much of its glory for two reasons. It affirmed a strict hierarchy because it flows from top to bottom, and it was mainly understood as a passive form of contact that makes a virtue out of ignoring and indifference. Respect, on the other hand, is affirmative, valuing the other in guarding his or her share of some kind of auratic human dignity. The term respect compensates the deficits of the term tolerance, which, however, cannot be dismissed altogether, I would argue. There are many things that we tolerate but cannot respect, such as neo-Nazis or pornography. But we do not tolerate child pornography. During the last years, many things that had been tolerated have become intolerable. In earlier epochs, many institutions were tolerated, such as slavery and child labor, or the exclusion of women from higher forms of education or election. The same is true for forms of anti-Semitism and racism. Inversely, we are tolerating much today that was unthinkable in earlier times, such as homosexual marriages. When it comes to discrimination, exploitation, and repression of individuals, we have come to be highly sensitive. When it comes, however, to the extending of the boundaries of individual lifestyles, we have come to be much more liberal. The new concept of respect has supplanted older forms of respect, such as status respect or the respect for personal achievements. There is a striking difference now between these older forms of respect and this new one. Formerly, respect used to be paid, and you have it even in German. You have this old-fashioned word zollen, which means zahlen. It has to be paid to those whom society had singled out for this form of veneration. Today, respect is claimed by those who were traditionally cut off from it. It claims respect for those from whom it had been notoriously withheld, the political outsiders, the victims of colonial imperialism, the social underdogs. It is significant that the term emerged in hip-hop within the frame of a global popular youth and performance culture. The term respect has now been introduced into cross-cultural youth culture, and I could quote you from www.respect.de, but I will skip this quote and move on to this more general form, which I will call now cultural respect. Respect thrives on difference. Men differ ethnically in races, culturally in languages, traditions, socially in classes, age-wise in generations, and individually in physical constitution and abilities. While highlighting differences, respect creates at the same time a connection that overcomes the dividing aspects of this difference through forms of positive recognition. There are, however, as we all know, very clear limits to cultural respect. Respect can only be paid to cultural differences to the extent that, that they do not violate the universal value of human dignity and human rights that guarantee and protect human sameness in a world of cultural otherness. Whatever violates these fundamental transcultural values, such as feudal codes of honor and vengeance, the mutilation of female genitals, and other forms of sexist violence within patriarchal and macho traditions, can neither be respected nor tolerated. Such practices are a manifestation not of respectable cultural difference, but of a shocking lack of transcultural civility. This brings me now to my last key term after politeness and respect, transcultural civility. While politeness emphasizes sameness, respect thrives on difference. It is claimed and affirmed in asymmetrical situations of otherness and inequality. There is, however, another form of respect which we may call ethical respect, that is based on the value of human rights and involves a claim for mutual sameness within and across cultural difference. The value of human rights has often been referred to as a Western invention anchored in a specific historical and cultural legacy. This image of human rights as a colonial Western product for export has obstructed its implementation in other parts of the world. It is obvious that an acceptance of ethical respect has not spread automatically like the flow of images and messages across the satellites and channels of the internet. Given these impediments, how can we argue for this dimension of cultural sameness in alliance with the recognition of cultural otherness? As a first step in approaching this problem, I want to introduce the distinction between culture and civility. Culture, term only used in the plural, is to stand here for what makes humans differ and different from each other. These differences are grounded in traditions, histories, different symbolic worlds, which guide human thoughts, creations, actions. These differences have to be or deserve to be affirmed, acknowledged, and respected, as they are the basis for distinct cultural identities. As animals in biotopes, humans live in cultural semiospheres, to use Lotman's expression. I jump now to the, and these semiospheres are the object of cultural respects. They are the object of recognition as equally valid formations which must not be destroyed, mutilated, or repressed in political power constellations. Now, the term civility, which is used here in the singular, is redefined in this opposition to stand for those values and practices which are negotiable across cultural loyalties. It is based not on differences but on similarities, emphasizing what concerns and connects all human beings alike. Humans are neither strictly different from each other nor strictly similar, but both. They differ in their cultural symbols, but are similar, as I want to argue, in their standards of civility. By this term, I mean a number of basic universal values, such as bodily integrity or the right to physical and intellectual development, irrespective of sex and status. The catalogue of human rights is anchored and summed up in the principle of human dignity, a key term in the recent Arab revolutions. There is a time for affirming respect and acknowledging differences, but there is also a time for doing the exact opposite, for ignoring markers of difference, neglecting or tolerating them as unimportant. It is important now to stress that the principle of civility is not bound to any individual culture. There can be no cultural monopoly with respect to this value. The value of human rights needs to be severed, therefore, from its historical roots, because the important question is not who invented them, but who claims and respects them now. The recent revolutions in Arab countries have shown that human rights are a value that emerges, we come back to emergence, and is called into existence wherever it is contested, claimed, and fought for, whatever the cultural and historical consequences or circumstances may be. The civil populations of countries fought against the sclerotic political alliance between power and greed, and for transcultural rules of civility, which, by the way, these new standards, they have been inspired by, they have been gotten mainly through the networks of the internet and the social networks of communication, which have profoundly transformed their living conditions and the standards for these young members of these societies. The young generation that has picked up and used these new technical possibilities have gained a wider perspective and raised their discontent to rage. Come to my conclusion. We have started the term politeness, which was introduced in the early 18th century in London as a new value and practice of a liberal society. It created a new and important bond between individual and society by socializing the individual and individualizing the society. In the late 20th century, individualism was complemented by new forms of collective identities which claimed respect for cultural differences. This affirmation of difference, however, also needs to be complemented this time by the values of transcultural civility, which register human sameness and set limits to the emphasis on cultural otherness. Civility in this sense is not part of individual cultures, but a framing condition for all cultures. It is what transcends cultures, but also what anchors them. It is the code that grants humans the status of citizens of the world and ensures living together on the shrinking and endangered globe. Thank you very much.
And respect. So what they claim is, queremos respeto. We want respect. And once a value is Latino and very male Latino, that's what the male Latinos are claiming, so no Latina student I have at Stanford would I talk respeto, you think it may be a different orbit. So the point I want to make is like this, and ultimately the question, are they compatible? Can you combine them? That tolerance, civility, politeness, what their common denominator is not to make certain claims that used to be made or that you could even make rightfully, but you forego them in order to have a better atmosphere of communication. Whereas once you start, I would say respeto, or respect, is the weakest form of claiming something. So you claim something, and when you say respect, you are close, as you were saying, to dignity. So dignity, there's something you claim. And of course, if you go pride and so forth, you claim more. I have nothing against pride, by the way, but nevertheless, the question is whether, given the semantic difference of them and the behavioral difference they prescribe, A, whether one can combine them, which you did and I found interesting, and B, perhaps whether in the present situation, I don't know, but I'm trying that out, in the present situation that you are alluding to, one is to try the perhaps impossible and to combine them, because the whole point is that the mere tolerance attitude works for upper class contexts. But as long as I'm just tolerant vis-a-vis certain Chicano, you know, the garden, whatever, Chicano way of life, that's not enough, and I think they rightfully want respeto, but respeto is more in the different paradigm. So the question is, does one have to combine the two, and can one combine the two sides?
Thank you. It was a kind of story, because it has a temporal structure here. I started with politeness, and I also referred to tolerance. These are the earlier concepts. And it turned out, well, politeness, I could skip the paragraph, but it is, of course, still valid. We're not giving one up in favor of the next one, but the next one is the complement for or to address the deficits of the experience with one of these terms. So for politeness and tolerance, we needed to complement or compensate. We needed respect that created actually really a new situation. It had a lot to do with this validating, rehabilitating the other as the victim of history, also on the social scale, the affirmative action, those from whom all had been withheld. Therefore, we have now the new structure of claiming it, being endowed with it, or granted it, and but my point is that the story has to go on. We are not in the last and final stage. We will not be able to just get rid of the respect anymore, even though we said it has generated problems. Absolutely. Thank you for your statement. Therefore, emphasizing the question, the limit of respect. This is exactly the question that I'm saying. My paper, and this is why I, as an answer, as a possible answer, logical answer to this question, I introduce civility here, which I reinvest, which is no longer the early stage. So, for the third stage, all the accumulated aspects, but now we have another, and here I really argue we need another norm, otherwise we cannot limit respect. Respect will overgrow, will create more problems perhaps than it has abolished, and therefore what we are in need of is another dialectic, which is being actually started. And I'm more or less only describing the situation, and therefore I would again emphasize there's a story behind it, which I am sort of witnessing as it envelops or develops, evolves.
I think my question is something of a follow-up to Sepp's. I wanted to start with a similar point, which is that, from my personal observation of hip-hop culture, respect is actually a very aggressive term, which is used as a challenge to people around you. It's a challenge to as you say, a system of social inequality, but it's one which is coached in very uncivil ways very often, and it's often heard in the negative. Right? It's like, he dissed me, is the opposite of respect. Someone expressed disrespect to me, and so I shot him. This is like the typical sort of California like road rage situation, right? Someone dissed me on the road, and so I killed him. Right? It's a very aggressive social phenomenon. This youth culture around respect in California is particularly what I'm thinking about in Los Angeles, which doesn't seem to me to present many possibilities for productive social interaction at all. And in fact, it can be quite sort of dangerous. I wanted to propose as a pragmatic alternative to civility, however, something that I see all the time, and I really associate mostly with New Yorkers. Which is something like it's a version of tolerance, but this is not tolerance from the top down. It's sort of a mutual ironic tolerance at the level of the street, right? It's the situation in Los Angeles where the person disrespected me, so I shot him, is diffused in New York by this strange step to the side with an ironic smile, right? And where people can say things that are really, really egregious and awful to each other, and then they can smile at each other and just sort of step away, disengage. And it's that sort of tolerant, not entirely well-disposed stepping away, which is the key to the sort of robust ability of so many people who actually continuously offend one another to exist side by side and somehow enjoy themselves in sort of New York street life. So it's sort of a more pragmatic solution. It's not politesse, it's not civility, it's sort of a nasty incivility with an ironic smile, which leads to a sort of a robust ability to live together.
Okay. Thank you very much. These are really valuable ethnographic, glimpses of, from the streets of the United Cities or landscapes of the United States, and they're quite important. The introduction of respect here, of course, cannot be limited to the road rage incident and also to the going wrong with this. The experience of this term going wrong in certain courses of interaction. I mean, I connect this term now. This is a description, of, let me say, the 90s. 1990s, especially the high point of cultural studies. Actually, cultural studies, the discourse was really geared to this value of respect. We have to see it in a little bit wider. I want to reimagine this time, which maybe is already very far away from us today, but still it is part of a history that we have gone through and that we cannot annul, because we don't like this situation. And I absolutely agree with you here. Let me just read to you what I skipped from the internet. www.respect.de, it says, this is the communication platform Respect, which calls for an unbiased contact between young people, be it in the internet, at events, or at competitions. The term respect is derived from the culture of hip-hop and calls for a recognition of more of oneself and of others, their talents, their style, their being different. In new forms, like in cyber diaries, this idea of respect can be lived. Now, this has, of course, a very pedagogical quality. It is really the answer to the problems that you describe, and so it's not a description of what happens, but it is a kind of pedagogic instillment of respect on those who really do not use it in that civil form, but use it in very uncivil forms. So that is all very clear. It has to be paid attention to, but I still would say the term respect itself is much wider than those instances of using it or abusing it. And again, when I thought about these things, I knew that respect is a dead end. That was my own concept of it or observation of it, and this is why I was looking for a new path or a kind of possibility to transcend it. And here I think, because respect is a norm, we can only counter it with another norm. This is why I am introducing here, I'm sorry, a very normative position, which is not so much normative, it's more the description of the evolution of norms. So I think as people in the humanities, we cannot avoid touching norms. I mean, I've sensed that there is a kind of phobia when norms are concerned. We better not touch them. They're something to refrain from, but they are still part of of what we observe. I mean, we cannot blind ourselves that norms are part of everyday life, and it's from this point of view. I'm not really inscribing or prescribing here, but I'm describing the evolution of norms.
It's my remark, Oksana Gavrishina. I don't know, I think it may be useful to think about this words or concepts, politeness and respect and civility, in terms of space as a very interesting dynamics between proximity and distance. And then your examples, of course, start to work very well. And it seems that what's interesting, that distance would also correspond with the idea of vision, visibility. When a group claims respect, it claims to be visible, while proximity would certainly have a bodily expression, sort of somatic expression. And then you can sort of try to play or work with, these ideas of distance, visibility, and proximity, and sameness, and bodily sameness and see, how it'll work and how it'll sort of wrap up or open up. Because I think it's very interesting to see that, and I very much like the dynamic dimension which you offered between civility and respect. Then we might think that we, in fact, need to cultivate both sort of respect and civility and sort of tolerance to both distance and proximity, and then that can be quite interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful to integrate the terms proximity and distance. And I think one of the interesting things about Shaftesbury was that he thought about distance in terms of proximity. So that was exactly this new idea of social politeness that he invented, because up till then politeness was only interactive. But now he also thought of it in a more generalized, more distance form. And especially the last value of intercultural civility, of course, has to do with a huge difference. We don't see the people who are weird acting. Right? So it's very important for me to take up your suggestion and rethink it along these lines. Thank you.
Your genealogy of politeness and civility starts with British liberalism and Shaftesbury, but there is, of course, intolerance, of course, lock basically to this British context. But there is, of course, a very different genealogy of civility, which was described by Norbert Elias, which is related to court society and fundamentally to a monopolization of violence by an absolute power. So in this case, and more if you want Hobbesian case, you have to impose civility and politeness on society, and this imposition of civility and politeness itself of extreme violence. So it's something which is repressing all this instinct. So politeness and civility is a product for attitude. Do you think that basically liberal attitude, kind of human education to impose? I think society should impose. I think in the United States, the tolerance, for instance, to gay marriage, which is problematic, but it could absolutely change the moment to be legally. It will recognize the tolerance to gay marriage will be imposed, and it will be at a certain moment norm. Do you think there is kind of, I don't know, huge possibility to reach this ideal or not?
I think there are different cultures of politeness, and in this case, they come from England. And you mentioned Hobbes, and Shaftesbury actually, when he wrote about these things, he was always thinking about Hobbes. He was counting Hobbes. He knew all about this. Is why it's a post-traumatic. It's not post-traumatic. It's also post-ideological society. He wants to get out of the logic of that particular type of society for which Hobbes, in this case, was a spokesman. So it's interesting that we have these roots of each other. They are really they have dialectics here. And I think the opposite is not only is man at bottom. These are meta again of different anthropologies. What is called pessimist or anthropology. Man is at bottom wild and aggressive, or man is at bottom good, warm-hearted, empathetic, and so forth. Shaftesbury's position is more that he trusts the individual, that he can self-educate himself. So he doesn't need that much of external. So he doesn't have this Foucaultian stance towards the whole thing, that because he believes in self-discipline, or he thinks at least this is teachable, and he wants to implant it, and whether it works or not. But Elias, I think, is in the middle, because for Elias it's a lot about internalization and also forming a self-approved attitude towards this. It's not just external pressure. The whole history. So I think it's interesting that we have the dialectic already within the English tradition. But then, of course, we go to other cultures, and they have very different stories to tell, because I'm sure that Japan and China and India, they all have their histories and traditions of civility as well.
Да, Татьяна Венедиктова. Вот там далеко, Оля.
My question really grows out of Kevin's question, and it's whether you think that civility and politeness go necessarily together with irony as trope and attitude, and also whether this we might not think of irony as a useful tool, but also not a risky tool. I myself am a 19th century person, and I like this anecdote of two supremely cultured ironists, Stendhal and Mirimet, being friends, and one of them coming to another's apartment in the other's absence would leave a note on the table saying, "Beware of irony." So there would be opportunities to irony, also risk. What would you say to this?
Okay. Well, thank you for coming back to this part. I have not responded to the notion of irony. I just had a longer conversation on comedy and and caricatures, especially also the Muhammad caricature, the Christians also with that is the irony. And what came out of our long conversation was that probably for irony to work, you need to have a basic social bond that has, or kind of social contract that has to work. Irony does not work if you don't have this contract. It also starts not to work with children, where you don't have it. Irony. So it is a very complex thing, and very often you don't have this basic. Therefore, in Constance, I was inspired for this very much from a colleague from Delhi, who came to Constance to work for a year, and he introduced to us the term of sameness and difference. And I think these are really different tools. And we have not worked and touched yet, so this is an attempt to work with them. And the whole idea was that we came from Delhi, from a the emphasis on difference, that again, cultural studies installed and instigated emphasis on difference is so detrimental. You cannot afford to live in a country where you have Muslims and Hindus and always emphasize and a difference. So we have developed new strategies of finding sameness in difference. That is the absolutely liberating perspective. We have to shift perspective from time to time, and also shift from one rather closed frame of perspective and open up our mind, sometimes from a colleague coming from a totally different continent, telling us there is another way of looking at things. And this is, I think, what is really liberating. Try to look at it in a different way. And the whole question of sameness and difference gains a new context once we see that we can shift perspective. We can accept difference in terms of respect, but we can shift, and we can also see sameness. So we are no longer tied by our own tools. And this is, I think, something that is very dangerous in cultural studies. We get all these terminologies and terms, and they are also always very value-laden, whether we accept this or not, whether we know it or not, they're value-laden. And then to know there's another term and we can shift, for me at least, this was very, very liberating.
Probably the last question here.
I'll try to be short. It seems that somehow I get lost when you were talking about the post-ideological age. I don't really sure that I understand what do you mean.
Well, that is again a very subjective intuition more. I'm impressed with, and here I come back to youth revolutions, and I get started with Iran in June 2009. The point was that they acted on different grounds than their parents had done a generation earlier in the 60s. They were ideology-driven. The earlier revolution was ideology-driven. ideology means you have to read many books before you go out into the street. You have to absorb a lot of knowledge. You have to have clear concepts. You have to have terms, and you need charismatic figures. You need, all this. They went into the street without all of this. They had none of it. What they had was just their idea, okay, and what they received of other countries, and this, I think, how the youth revolution started, not with concepts and ideologies, but with a kind of lifestyle demands. Yeah? And this is how rage that actually propelled the revolution started. They saw a growing difference between their actual living conditions and what they thought would be much ones. So instead of this ideological frame which we were used to, they just acted upon these, much more spontaneous emotions coming back into politics and history, almost take the place now of ideology, I would argue. And also they are spreading very quickly through the of contact. And this is what I sum up now more or less as a ideological age, with respect, of course, only to these new developments which we are developing exactly along the lines considered state. We have to be watching for the new, something actually new that we are not yet familiar with can happen, and I think it has happened, and we have also to look at it and analyze it more precisely than I can now at this point.
Thank you so much. And just before, it's a pity to let you go because we have so many questions, but just a very small ethnographic remark. Do you know when a Russian company becomes drunk, people usually start asking each other, do you respect me? Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.